Morning, Roberta.
Is here.
Good morning. Good morning.
So we're going to start on, we're starting this Torah portion of Tazria, and Tazria started with the idea of a woman giving birth, and the whole idea of blood and a loss of potential life, whether it's potential life through the ovulation and menstruation, or actual life in giving birth, which is a big simcha. It's wonderful, but that extra soul that the woman has been carrying is no longer being carried. It's now a distinct and separated soul. So she has a loss of a certain charge of spirituality, that an extra gift of spirituality, of soul life, that she no longer had, that she had for 9 months, and that I guess what I would say, coming back to baseline, is something that's a little destabilizing, is probably the best word I can come up with right now, and that is reflected in this spiritual imbalance. Now we moved on to that, to the primary topic of both this and the next Torah portion, which is what we call tzarat. Tzarat is what used to be translated as leprosy. The King James, I believe, has it as leprosy. Even some Torah English original Torah English translations had it as leprosy, but it's clearly not leprosy. It's a spiritual, miraculous spiritual condition that helps us understand more what's going on inside our soul. We can look at our body and be aware of our soul condition. So we're going to have a rather lengthy Hasidic insight here, but before we do that, let's go to the closer look. A closer look, it tends to be more just the legalistic end of things. And in verse 2, we had described, the Torah describes several different shades of this white. And one of them is called a wool white spot. And that's the way we translate it. Now, the actual term Hebrew for the wool white spot, se'et or se'es, actually means, and it's used in the Torah and used even in today's Hebrew, the core of it means to lift up or to be raised up. So when it says, it's trying to describe the nuts and bolts of it and what the word means. When two patches of color are placed side by side, the darker colored area will appear raised relative to the lighter colored area. It's just an optical illusion. Thus, the Hebrew word for a wool white spot literally means raised. Why? Since its whiteness is less intense than that of we have two of them later, which is called a beheret, and that which we said that was like one was about the snow, and therefore appears raised in comparison to it, even though it appears sunken in comparison to the unaffected surrounding skin. This is nothing, just nuts and bolts, different types of colors, brighter and duller, and why one of them is called se'ed, that it's raised, it appears more raised compared to the other. And it covers an area. How much area does it need to cover? Everything in Torah, it's a law. It has to know what, is it a millimeter? The area is further equated with the average area covered by 36 hairs. 6 hairs by 6 hairs as they grow naturally in the body. And the spot need not be a perfect square, but if it was less than 6 hairs wide, it is not considered tzaras, no matter what its length. Okay, and this is, we have in the Talmud and the Mishnah, very detailed and intricate laws of this spiritual affliction, which we no longer experience. So it becomes that much more difficult to study it when you've never seen it. Okay, now we'll get to something a little closer at home, the Hasidic insights. Top of 86 to the right. So in number 2, we had said that this is something that tends to afflict people who are actually otherwise good character. And I had printed out, if I remember correctly, I printed out last time we met something from Maimonides in his laws of tzarat, and how he ends his laws of tzarat. And there you can see that there are actually 2 different types of lashon hara. which in Lashon Hara means this malicious gossip. One is that it's malicious. I called it malicious gossip, but it actually doesn't have to be. If in a work situation where we're trying to get a supervisor out of his job or whatever it is, and we can start a campaign, and we can feel justified in it because it's all true. But that kind of talk has its focus is ultimately it's going to be hurting someone, and that could be in social situations too. That type of malicious gossip is something that is forbidden by Torah, but that's actually not what we're talking about really here. What we're talking about here is a much more subtle and less pernicious, in the sense it's less obvious side type of gossip, where we're just talking. So if I said to one of you, "Oh, I saw Jim on Facebook. I see he went on vacation again." That's not criticizing anyone. Not saying anything negative about someone, unless, in my mind, and maybe I know in your minds, this is someone who just flies around more than we consider proper. I'm just finding an example. The example of that's brought in Torah law is, someone, if a poor person comes along, one should go over to Yankel's house. He always has something cooking on the stove. That could mean that he's very his family is very generous, or that they're gluttons. So talking about people doesn't always have to be straight up negative in order for it to be Lashon Hara. And because it's not straight up negative, and even because we don't necessarily consciously recognize that we have a little bit of a resentment that's feeding that comment, it becomes much more difficult a problem to spot. So what did I say? What I said was benign. No one can prove what I was thinking, and again, sometimes I'm not 100% sure of what I was thinking, because the resentment is something that's in the back of my head, and it's just I carry it with me. Or I know what it would trigger in the listener, even though it doesn't make a difference to me. I know it'll get a rise out of it. It'll be interesting to them. I'm not trying to make trouble, but I'm making a comment that I know that my listener will find interesting. It makes me interesting. And meanwhile, the other person the person we're speaking about now looks a little bit, has some negativity stirred against him or her. So let's look at Hasidic insights number 2. It says individuals of otherwise sterling character. So the task. So before I say that, so the idea therefore is that tzaras is a favor to this person who really, in their self-image and truly in their lives, they really try to do the right thing. If they saw their technical Lashon Hara, their gossip, as a violation of God's law, they would have shut their mouths. But it's that subtle and that seemingly benign that they themselves don't recognize what it is. And now all of a sudden they have a growth. They say, "Oh, what did I do?" And then they go back to retrace their steps and see, "Oh, something, I really shouldn't have said that." So the tzaras was a soul feedback, as Rhonda put it, that was very helpful to us, but it only worked if there was generally things were cleansed. So now you see a spot on a perfectly clean white gown, and you see a little spot because against the backdrop of whiteness, it shows up. If there's there's a bit of a mess here and there, so a tiny little spot is going to be eclipsed by everything else, and that's kind of a metaphor for who the tzaras would show up for. So now let's get to this. The task of refining ourselves, of realizing the Torah's vision for us as human beings, is long and arduous, but entirely possible to implement. So what the way they're launching their understanding of this is really with getting to the heart of Chabad thought, because the heart of Chabad thought is in a book called Tanya. And the Tanya has 5 different sections, but really the soul of Tanya, of where it was going, is a spiritual analysis of how it's possible for us to be the human beings the Torah lays out for us. Because the Torah does say Moses, before he passes away, says this is not impossible. It's very doable for you to be who God wants you to be in the way you speak and the way you feel and the way you act. That's Moses talking to us. And Moses is not just using flowery language. Now, in his analysis, Rabbi Shneur Zalman digs deep into this and says that it's actually a high bar of what the Torah wants of us. To get to a space where, and we're going to get into this a little bit now, get into a space where I do no harm. I just have to watch myself, right? And usually no one's forcing me to do something negative. So action, behavior, if we're conscious and watching, it's quite controllable. Speech really would be the same. Now, speech is a little, we have throwaway lines, and sometimes we get a little careless, and I think we all know that, myself included. It's more difficult to watch. But if I know I have a problem of that, I get a little careless or maybe a little insulting, whatever it is in certain settings or contexts, or after L'chaim, then maybe I can watch myself, just keep my mouth shut. So I'm going to be quiet, because by opening my mouth, I know that I'm creating a hazard for myself where I may misstep. And I'm a spiritually conscious person, so keeping my mouth shut is relatively possible. What's very difficult to see is, what do we do about thought? Thought is very difficult, because thought, unless you're deep in meditation, you're not going to shut down your mind. And if that's the case, keeping your mind in the right place, many people might say, well, as long as you're not acting on it, who cares what you're thinking, fantasizing, whatever. Torah thought actually says it is a problem. It may not be an infraction, an official violation, but it's something we should be watching. We don't want to put our heads into the wrong places. So take a look at this. It says like this: the task of refining ourselves, of realizing the Torah's vision for us as human beings, is long and arduous, but entirely impossible to implement. The Torah itself testifies that fulfilling its instructions is not in heaven, not beyond the sea, but very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, making it easier for you to fulfill it. That's what Moses told us before he passed away. Moreover, at each step of the way, God assists us in navigating the subtle pitfalls that thread the thwart our progress. In the words of the sages, when someone sets out to purify himself, he is assisted from above. So we technically, and in principle, we have set out before us a difficult job. It seems difficult, although the Torah tells us it's not so difficult. And Tanya tries to help us understand how it's actionable, it's possible. And part of that is we do our work, but God helps us. In the language of the Talmudic dictum is, when one of us, any of us are trying to become better, we have God's wind at our back. This principle is demonstrated clearly by the phenomenon of tzaras, which affects only individuals who have refined themselves as much as they can using all the resources available to them. So a person has really tried to refine themselves. They've used the study of Torah, the practice of mitzvahs, introspection, repentance, cultivation of ethical conduct in business and personal life, the development of mature faith, trust in God, devotion to one's mission, and alacrity in performing it, and so on. So here they lay out a bunch of things, which are all these are different. Each of them is really a work, a job unto themselves. And here's a person who really focuses in all these areas, trying their best and utilizing all these tools to the fullest. The individual might eventually purge all the dross from his psyche. It is possible within the human condition for a person to actually purge all the negativity from the psyche, even from the thought. Therefore, transforming himself into an 87, an altogether righteous person who no longer has to wrestle with evil. So here, what they're saying, and this is really, as I say, this is a crux of founder of Chabad, Rabbi Zalman, in his book of Tanya. He describes what that there is a certain, there's a complexity to the term we use in Talmudic thought or in the Torah itself. There's a Hebrew word tzaddik. Tzaddik means saintly. So tzaddik can mean that I can go say something. Two people come to court, two litigants, and one is found righteous about in this specific case where he was accused of stealing from someone else. So they are, in this case, you can say that tzaddik, they have the tzaddik. Doesn't mean that they are in their character a tzaddik, or a righteous person. It means that here they didn't do that thing wrong. They were acting correctly. And in a broader sense, you could say a person who does more good things than negative things, which is all of us, hopefully, then we are tzaddikim. And indeed, the verse tells us that we are all the righteous. Why? Because we all do more good than negative. But there is also a piece of Talmud that tells us that the tzaddik is very rare, and occurs maybe only once or twice in a generation. So how do you square that with the idea that we're all righteous, and then actually it's a rare occurrence? So Rabbi Zalman explains is that tzaddik is a broad term, and it can mean the idea of you do more good than negative. That's talking about your actions, but talking about the person, to use it as a label, as a description for a personality, is much more focused, and it's a much deeper idea. And for a person to be a tzaddik, it means that not only do they control their behavior so that there's nothing wrong, and all their speech, there's nothing wrong, but they even control their mindsets and the language is that really that even their impulse to negativity has been squelched, because it's for even a person, for most of us, the most we can hope for is that we control our behaviors and our speech, and even if we have an instinct. So I'm sitting at a party, and this person who had hurt my feelings is and I have a chance to say something, and that would make me feel a little better and slap the person down a little bit, and I control myself. I don't. It's a rare person who can really control themselves all the way, but to get rid of the instinct, the impulse to do something negative, it's for most of us that's not possible. Now, and we have it in little slivers of our lives. We can look at it and say, I think most people we consider healthy have not only never practiced pedophilia, they have no instinct, they have no draw, there's no gravitational pull. It's something repulsive to them, morally and physically. So in that sense, we're like a tzaddik. Because it's not only we don't do it, there's no part of us that wants to do it. And it's hard to know our subconscious, but can even assume even subconscious. Now, but other things we would like, if we could. It's not, if I'm walking through an airport and I smell bacon and eggs, it's not that it doesn't smell good to me, it's just that it's not my deal. I'm not going to have it, and I never did. But it's not that it doesn't smell good to me. So the idea of so I would never even entertain the thought of going to go buy and eat it. But the idea that there's some pull in me towards it, not consciously, but it does smell good to me. So for a tzaddik, anything that is against, that violates or God's will is absolutely out of bounds, and we can even say repulsive. That's a very rare existence. It's that the person does everything right, and even their conscious and subconscious is totally cleansed. Now, it's hard to know if your subconscious is totally cleansed, and we find in the Talmud also of people, great righteous people we look up to for thousands of years, who aren't sure that they themselves are a tzaddik. It's not because they're trying to be humble. It's how do I know? How do I know what's inside of me? How do I want to know my subconscious? So here we're talking about a person who no longer has to wrestle with evil consciously, and generally then, if the person has truly cleansed their self-conscious, and they are one of those rare, one or two of a generation, so such a person's life challenge is now to constantly ascend to ever higher levels of divine consciousness and to inspire others to emulate his or her example. So it's something where we're living, a person's living a certain way, and they're no longer wrestling with evil. They don't have that challenge. Wake up in the morning where they're supposed to. They want to try and deepen their connection with God on a positive level and try to inspire others. Now, on the other hand, after the individual has exhausted all these tools, some subtle evil might still remain. It's possible for a person to be a really good person and totally flawless in their practice, but subconsciously, there's something there. They're not a pure tzaddik, even though for our purposes they are, because again, who gets the X-ray of the subconscious? And that evil would lurk so deep within the individual that he might never become aware of it on its own. So the person is acting good, is not feeling any pull towards anything negative. So as far as they know, they are a true total tzaddik in their own introspection. When this is the case, but if there is something there, God signals to him this effect by afflicting him with tzaras. So the tzaras is a favor to a person like this, who simply can't consciously find any, not only negative behavior, even an instinct, an inclination toward negative behavior. And the tzaras shows them there's something still there. Something is still buried there, something for them to work on. Then parentheses, it is therefore understood why tzaras no longer occurs. Since the destruction of the temple, it's simply not possible for us to refine ourselves so consummately that the only imperfections left within us are those that are signaled by the onset of tzaras. Since we can't do anything, since the destruction of the temple, we can no longer be a tzaddik from the overwhelming majority of us. So then we're not going to be to that level where the tzaras is something, right? Good morning, Lori, is going to be something that needs signaling. So the reason we don't have tzaras is because we're not good enough for tzaras. So to continue again on the right side of 87, the second paragraph, when the only evil remaining within a person is of such a subtle nature, like we just said, where it's deeply subconscious, and there's no instinct and there's no impulse, but the potential is still there. They still have the capacity still to appreciate something negative. It can only surface in very superficial, unpremeditated behavior. So that's a person who's never going to deliberately go and try and malign someone. That's someone who's not going to deliberately say something that's going to hurt someone's feelings or smear their reputation. It slips out. And as I said, sometimes those negative things slip out and we don't even realize exactly why we said it. Because on the face of it, what did I say? Going for another trip? there's always something on the stove, whatever. It's not in and of itself. You're not saying that the person is evil. You're not saying the person is bad. You're not saying I saw that person steal. You're saying something that on the face of it is benign, and even in our minds it might be benign. Our type of such behavior is gossip, which often takes the form of a casual remark that slips through otherwise innocuous conversation. It feels innocuous. Speech is indeed a superficial activity. Speech is, when you mean superficial activity, compared to thought, where controlling thought is much more difficult. Speech, you just keep your mouth shut, is therefore relatively easy to control. And that's why the reason why it is one of the first aspects of our lives that we're bidden to refine in books of Torah thinking, of ethical thinking. Say focus on only if you can open your mouth, check first to make sure there's something constructive coming out of here, and that there's no tinge of anything otherwise. And that we can control our mouth. Like I say, we just none of us likes to just sit in a crowd and be quiet. But if we can get comfortable with that, then we can become more analytical about our speech. But speech is on the one hand, it's more controllable, but it's also an expression of the soul, and therefore unrehearsed speech can at times betray the inner recesses of the heart. Sometimes what we say, if we think about it later, in the privacy of our own mind, we're taking a walk, we're going to bed, we're taking a shower, whatever it is, we realize that there was there's probably there was a strain of buried resentment in that, in that comment that I had about the person I spoke about, even though I wasn't actively trying to hurt them or malign them. For these reasons, Torah afflicts in particular people who are guilty of nothing else but gossip. So tzeras, therefore, what does it do? It's something where a person's a good person. They're clean. And now God is giving them the gift of saying you're not as clean as you could be, because there's something more subconscious there. And it appears on the superficial elements of their lives. When it starts, and we didn't get into this yet in the Torah, you'll see the Torah is going to talk in this Torah portion, talks about tzeras on the skin, tzeras on the clothes, tzeras on the house. But in the order of how it afflicts a person, it's the opposite. It first appears on in the superficial elements of their lives: their skin, their clothing, and their houses. These entities are three increasingly external layers that envelop us. Our skin is our innermost layer of clothing, so to speak, tailored perfectly to our bodies. So skin is also, it's not me, my soul, but it's part of me, right? My soul and my body come together. Next come our actual clothes, also cut to fit our bodies, but not as precisely as our skin. And finally, our homes, into which we fit, conducting our essential life activities within them, but which are the least precisely tailored to us physically. So you have the house, which, even if you take a look, if you walk into a house and the people, the owners are not there, sometimes you can tell a little bit about the people, sometimes you can't. To tell their height or their, it's not necessarily a given. You see their clothing, you know much more about them, and certainly if you see them. So the house is a relatively, it's an external container for us. So tzeras first affects the outermost content. It starts on the outside, the house, because at first gossip is a totally superficial symptom. If the person's a good person, and this is just a little bit of resentment or anger, whatever it is, sneaking up subconsciously, so it's kind of extraneous to their normal operating system, their psyche. So, but it's a problem. It appears on the house to say, "You're good." There's this relatively extraneous problem, and we have to deal with it. And that's, so we have the house, it appearing on the house sends us that signal. If the individual does not take this cue and neglects to purge himself of his inner negativity, then tzeras breaks out on his clothing. So the person looks at it and says, "I don't understand. Why would I have tzeras in my house? And I'm good, and nothing happened." I don't understand it. It's there. I have to deal with it. But I can't find anything in me where I would be harboring resentment or something antisocial or some negativity within me, because I work so hard not to be that person. I don't feel that way. I don't see it in myself. Well, if God sees it within him and he's not getting the hint from the house, then it breaks out on his clothing, indicating that his unrestrained gossip has given the deep-seated flaws it expresses the chance to seep into him from the outside, so to speak, so that his behavior is less superficial than it was originally. So this is no good, because now it was kind of extraneous to my normal operating system, but me ignoring it is not just going to keep things static. It's more part of me, because I'm exercising and I'm feeding it, and therefore it's going to go more from the subconscious into the conscious, and therefore now it affects the clothing. See, it's getting closer. So it gives me another signal. If he ignores this cue as well, then Saras breaks out on his skin, indicating that this evil, although still superficial, is now part of him. Then he says that when it breaks out on his skin, see, it's clearly, I have a problem. It's part of me. At this stage, he must be ostracized from society. Ostracized from society is a strong word, but the idea is that he was quarantined. The person with Saraz outside the camp, outside the city, and it would be for until it went away, 7 days, whatever it was. But the message was that he's persisting in a behavior that is destructive to society, to community, and therefore to step away and get a grip, look at it, and deal with it, and then come back in. Hopefully, this demonstration of the consequences of his behavior will inspire him to mend his ways. Now, since Sarat is intended to cure the individual of his hidden evil, the diagnostic and purification rituals must be overseen by a priest. We had said that the priest is the one who comes in and says, he has Saras. Now, even though the priest might not be a Torah scholar, and because these are complicated laws, so you bring a Torah scholar who assesses it and says, yes, Saras. That's not a diagnosis. It has to go through the mouth of the priest. We have to have another priest there who could be totally illiterate. And the sage says, and sometimes there'll be a sage priest, but sometimes it wasn't. You just need a priest. It has to go through the system of the priest, and the priest says he has tzaraz, and now he's officially in that category. And when it comes to declaring him cleansed, that has to go through the mouth of a priest. And even if the greatest sages of Israel all stood around and said, no, he's good, he's not good. He's not ready to come back into the camp until it goes through the priest's mouth that say that he is pure. Since Saras is intended to cure the individual of his hidden evil, the diagnostic and purification rituals must be overseen by a priest. The priest is the earthly embodiment of God's infinite loving kindness, which alone is able to uproot and weed out this otherwise inaccessible evil. The priest represents kindness, and it represents in the earthly way, and represents God's loving kindness. So it's through loving kindness that we deal with this problem, and through the loving kindness that we heal this problem. Furthermore, it is specifically the priest's speech that frees the sufferer from his defilement. For in order to counteract the expression of the sufferer's inner evil via his unrectified speech, the priest must employ his power of holy speech to elicit the inner goodness of God's infinite loving kindness. So it's speech that blunts the effects of speech. So if there are any questions on that, we can explore those. If not, I can continue with the inner dimensions. Okay. And once or twice. Okay. So we'll turn back to 86. And on 86, at the bottom of 86, where it says inner dimensions, the inner dimensions in this edition of the Torah, of the Chumash, tends to be more the Kabbalistic, which is not as easy to explain or to understand, especially without a whiteboard, but let's try it. Tsaras. What is tsaras? Tsaras is a skin affliction. So, although tsaras does not result from any natural physiological condition, when divine providence decrees that this condition appear in a person, the resulting lesion is produced by limiting the circulation of blood in the area, which turns white. If you speak to a dermatologist, I'm going to assume, I don't know, if there's something, a whitened area of skin, that probably means that there's a circulation issue, because that all of a sudden became pale in comparison to the rest. So what does that mean? What's our circulation? What circulation is being interfered with us on a soul level? This obstruction is in turn the physical manifestation of its corresponding spiritual antecedent, the obstruction of the flow of divine consciousness from Chokhmah to Bina. So there's a circulation that should be going on in our inner system, in our soul system, in our psycho-spiritual system. And the circulation is what we call the 10 energies of the soul, starting from our powers of cognition and faith and inspiration to our action, our emotions that produce action. But it's all part of our internal circulation, and we want to have clear circulation between our mind, our cogitation, our rationale, with our emotions, and our behaviors. It's a healthy circulation, so to speak. And here they're talking about an interruption within the circulation, the soul's circulation, between the first two of those soul energies. One is called Chokhmah. Chokhmah means it's just in the general image of it is if you're working on a problem and you're trying to figure out, you've got some competing values and you're not sure how to solve it, and all of a sudden, I got it. The lightning bolt, the eureka. Now, you don't really have it yet. In your mind, you have a flash of inspiration that you have an idea, but then you've got to digest it and break it apart and say, does this work? So one of the things that was brought in Hasidic thought, we don't, when you have, once I got it, very often it's like, you don't disturb the person because 1 second, I think I have it. Why do I say 1 second? Because I don't have it yet. Once I've developed an idea, once I truly understand an idea, you can make all the noise you want. It's my idea, I own it. With Chachma, you don't own it. It's a little elusive. And with Bina, which is the next one, it's you've contemplated, you've fleshed it out, and you own the idea. So there's this flow. On the end of the way I just spoke about it, it's the flow of inspiration from our deeper or subconscious idea, whatever that we don't know about it. And when we're thinking, we're plumbing, our whatever it may be, we're trying to come up with an idea, and it hits us. The idea hit you. Where did it come from? It came from somewhere. It came from your deeper subconscious, but it's not within your conscious reality. So it's somewhat amorphous. It's a little bit beyond you. But once you deal with it, it becomes very much a part of your conscious. That's Bina. Now, Chokhmah is also synonymous with faith, because faith in connection to God is also, it's a little bit amorphous. It's I believe in God, I feel connected to God, but it's I look at a desk and a computer and a can of seltzer. I can fully get my mind around that and own it more. Like a relationship with God, one can, but it's more elusive. So here what we're saying is one of the names of God associated with Bina, which is the second one, contemplation, is Eke. Eke is when God spoke to Moses, and Moses from burning bush, and Moses said to God, when the Jews ask me what your name is, what do I tell them? He said, I will be what I will be, or however it's translated, but it's 2 words, Eheya Asher Eheya, I will be, and they say Eke, or they don't want to write out the name of God. So the numerical, that's a name of God, and we say that's a name of God that refers to Bina. Why? And we say that the numerical value of the regressive iteration of this name is 44. The numerical value of the word for blood. So that name of God, or that representation of our spiritual system, refers to the blood, which is like the circulatory. Because our consciousness has to circulate through everything and drive our emotions and our actions. So our contemplation. So the psychological equivalent of this blockage between Chachma and Bina occurs when we contemplate, as we should, God's transcendence and how He manifests Himself in creation. But our heightened awareness of God's presence does not cause us to feel nullified within that presence. So we can sit, all 5 of us on this phone, and we could talk about the beauty of the divine and how God is transcendent, which means that God's presence in the world is just a tiny whisper, a glimmer of God's presence. And God is truly infinite, and we are truly finite, and therefore the finite compared to the infinite is truly insignificant based on our own. Obviously, God finds us significant because God says, if you do this, I'll find it as significant. But God is transcendent, and God is beyond anything that we can imagine. So we can talk about it, we can contemplate on it, but it's possible to do that, even meditate on that, but still not feel surrendered to God's tremendous majesty. In their words, not to feel nullified within God's presence. When this self-nullification is lacking, our enhanced awareness of God can actually inflate our ego even further, instead of nullifying it as it should. And here was an important focus of Chabad thought, which made it unpopular in certain circles, was pointing out how Torah study is fantastic. It's unbelievable. But Torah study without proper attitude can make a person arrogant. Torah study doesn't make you, in and of itself, it's not going to make you a good person. A proper Torah attitude is going to make you a good person, and the Torah study will help you come closer to God and flesh out what it means to be a good person. But just it's possible for a person who's not a behaviorally and emotionally good person and not a nice person to be a Torah scholar. One doesn't contradict the other. So, and on the contrary, the more we understand of God, the more we may feel advanced. Say, I have a grasp of the divine. I can grasp the idea of, to the extent I can, of an infinite being and our place in the cosmos. And I might feel superior when I walk out of my class or my study session. Might feel superior to a friend who really has no access to that. So I think I could think to myself, they're still thinking about hot dogs and football, which are all good, and I'm thinking about the infinite God. So you can feel superior, and that is a problem. In the words of the sages, the Talmud tells us, if the student merits. If a Torah student is correctly poised, their study of Torah acts for him or her, 87 on the inner dimensions, as an elixir of life. It brings us life because I study Torah with a proper, humble attitude. If he does not, if he's studying Torah and it just augments arrogance and self-importance, it acts as an elixir of death. No death, obviously, it's a harsh word, but the idea is that it is spiritually is not tapping into life. And the word, it says, if one merits. The word for merit, zacha, it means in the Hebrew, it means to be refined. In other words, if we're refined, if we're emotionally, psycho-spiritually refined, and that in a Torah study in and of itself, one can know the entire Talmud by heart and not necessarily be a spiritually refined person. One would hope they are, but not necessarily. So it's intimating that the merit that determines whether the study of the Torah betters or debilitates the student is his degree of spiritual refinement, meaning their control of the ego. This amplified sense of self intoxicates us with overconfidence, which, unless checked, can corrupt us in many ways. It can feel that we're very evolved. And it can delude us into thinking we can safely lower our guard against enticements of materialism. I can say, I am so knowledgeable. That means, ergo, I'm a good person. Ergo, I'm a good Jew. Torah study, again, in and of itself is not going to do that, but it can delude us and think, how can I not be a super Jew or a great pleasure to God when I know so much Torah? And not thinking about how I'm treating another person, which might very well be not improperly, even though I know so much Torah. It can render us overly judgmental of others, hence the increased propensity towards gossip or slander. So that's who's being addressed here. It could be a Torah scholar, and their bina means that the contemplation, their capacity for understanding, that's great, but the circulation of the faith and the humility into their knowledge is not clear. So there's a circulation problem. The blood of humility and surrender to God and faith in God that really should be filling our Torah knowledge, that circulation is not happening. And therefore, on the body appears a circulatory problem. It can exaggerate our self-estimation, thereby leading us to depression when we fail to live up to our unrealistic expectations of ourselves and so on. Another area is that internally we can be hurting ourselves. Whatever the case, the forces of evil siphon off divine energy from this unbalanced bina. When we have just knowledge, but not knowledge without conscience, knowledge without humility, that can cause a lot of problems. Just the wisdom, scientific knowledge, we don't need that many. It's not hard to understand how scientific knowledge in the hands of immoral people can do much more damage than just a person being immoral next door, but not having the capacity to use that great weapon of great scientific or whatever is knowledge. This added opportunity for the forces of evil to insinuate themselves into our lives is reflected physically in the growth of white hair within the lesion. So this goes on to not only to the circulatory issue, but the hair within the lesion. As we will see later, hair represents a highly attenuated flow of energy, so attenuated that the forces of evil are allowed to tap it. I'll just finish the paragraph, then we'll talk about it. For this reason, hair must normally be kept short, in order to prevent the forces of evil from siphoning off more than the minimal divine energy that they're allocated for their continued existence. Hair, in us, this is it grows, right? So there's life there, but it's different than my hand or my toe, because if I snip off a piece of hair, it doesn't hurt me. My nails are the same. So hair is a Kabbalistic representation of force, of divinity, that is so trickle down, so attenuated as the language that becomes very, very, very diluted, because so that it can feed our world, because overwhelming with it, because there's a holiness to that. That's how we have godliness in the world without overwhelming our senses. So, but too attenuated would mean that it's also approachable by and able to feed negativity. So there's hair. There is a very complex topic in Torah. On the one hand, we have things like the beard or the Nazarite who lets the hair grow. There's something important to it. We say that there's a spiritual value to it. On the other hand, we talk about here the guy with the tzaraz, or the woman with tzaraz. They have to, after they're done, they shave off all their body hair. And it can grow back, but there's something with the hair. The Kohen, before they were inducted into being Kohen, there was shaving off of the hair. So the hair has, we see in it a certain power, but a potential danger we have to be careful about. And therefore, we say there's hair growing in this lesion, saying that it's reflecting an attenuated and therefore possibly misdirected energy. In order to restore the flow of Chachma to Bina, individual must be presented to a priest who presents chesed. So it goes Chochmah and Bina, that's the logical, and Das, which are the three intellectual faculties, and then it goes into the emotive. And the first of those is Chesed, which is connection or kindness or love, which is derived from Chochmah. I don't want to get into all this, but Sefirot being on the right axis of the Sefirot tree, the 10 Sefirot are split into 3, 3, and 4, but it's three different, often in the way they're presented, three different axes, I guess. And Chochmah, the faith or surrender, and kindness or love are on the same, they're both on the right axis. The priest then quarantines them for 7 days in order to allow the 7 lower subspheres of Chochmah to enter Bina, because each Kabbalistic sphere, so to speak, there are 10, and each one is subdivided into 10. And the lower ones are the ones, the active, where one flows into the next. So the 7 lower subspheres of Chochmah need to re-enter Bina, in other words, to regenerate the circulation. But there's always the 7 lower subspheres of a higher parts of is a Hebrew word, but it's a Kabbalistic word, which means it's a Kabbalistic energy. One energy to the next energy, like my mind, my thoughts, my framing generates how I feel. So in within God, it's a higher parts of that generates a lower parts of. So always the 7 lower subspheres of a higher parts of that become vested within a lower parts of, imparting to it its inherent sense of self-nullification before God. It's a mouthful. Think about that, and maybe there'll be questions next week.
I was going to say maybe circulate that seems like something that you would draw and
yes,
comment on.
Yes, yeah.
A
I'm not
picture.
much of a drawer, but you definitely, a whiteboard would make this easier.
Right. I think there is a whiteboard option here. Can you see on the menu? So I've never used it, but you could. So I think you can draw with your mouse. But.
Or maybe next week I can put up a diagram. I've done it before.
Right. They're sharing a document, but there's also an actual whiteboard option now on Zoom where you could be drawing, but you don't need to. Just putting in your head for a teacher. It says
whiteboards. I just don't know what it is. But it's
right.
Yeah, maybe
it's okay.
I can figure it out.
Only if you think it will help.
It's again, it's Kabbalistic. If it's something that we feel you want to understand more, I can try and re-enter this next week. No problem. Okay.
I'm okay with what you presented, but I know others can share separately.
Okay. So then let's see. I'll try and come up with something.
I think there's pictures in the JLI book and the courses with the diagram.
You're right. There definitely have been pictures. It's it's not going to be necessarily these seven subspheres of Chochmah to Bina, but that's easy for you to do once you see it all out there. Maybe I can come up with something. I'll try.
If it's easy to access a picture, I wouldn't mind seeing it. But if you have to go to any trouble, then I would not.
I appreciate it, but I'm gonna try.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, be well.
You too. Thank you very much.
Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.